What happens when Hollywood's most beloved action hero comes face to face with television's most relentless interrogator? You won't believe what unfolds when Harrison Ford sits down with George Stephanopoulos for what was meant to be a promotional appearance that spiraled into one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. The sparks flew, voices raised, and by the end of the night, America witnessed a legendary actor walk away from an interview in a way that left everyone speechless. The tension was palpable from the moment Ford stepped onto the set. Known for his gruff demeanor and no-nonsense approach to interviews, the 81-year-old actor had agreed to appear on Stephanopoulos' show to discuss his latest film project and reflect on his storied career. What neither the audience nor Ford himself anticipated was how quickly the conversation would veer into dangerous territory. Stephanopoulos, never one to shy away from controversial topics, had clearly done his homework. The veteran journalist sat across from Ford with a stack of notes and that familiar glint in his eye that suggested this wouldn't be the typical softball celebrity interview that Ford had grown accustomed to over the decades. The studio lights cast harsh shadows across both men's faces as they settled into their chairs, the audience sensing an undercurrent of tension that seemed to electrify the air. "Harrison, thank you for being here tonight," Stephanopoulos began, his voice carrying that deceptively warm tone that regular viewers knew often preceded his most pointed questions. Ford nodded curtly, already appearing slightly uncomfortable as he adjusted his position in the guest chair. The actor's body language spoke volumes, arms crossed, jaw set, eyes already showing signs of the wariness that comes from decades of dealing with probing journalists. "Let's start with your new film," Stephanopoulos continued, "but I have to ask about something that's been making headlines recently. There's been quite a bit of discussion about your comments regarding the current state of Hollywood and what you've called the woke agenda in the industry. Can you elaborate on what you meant by that?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Ford's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but those who knew him well could see the flash of irritation that crossed his features. This wasn't the direction he'd expected the interview to take, and it was clear from his silence that he was carefully considering his response. "I think," Ford began slowly, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly quality that had made him famous. "That's been taken out of context. I was talking about storytelling, about the craft of making movies that connect with audiences rather than checking boxes." But Stephanopoulos wasn't about to let him off that easily. "Yet you specifically mentioned concerns about what you called political correctness gone too far in Hollywood. Given your status as one of the industry's most respected figures, don't you think those comments carry significant weight?" The studio audience could feel the temperature in the room rising. Ford's publicist, seated just off camera, was visibly shifting in her seat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this conversation was heading. She had briefed Ford extensively about sticking to safe topics. The new movie, fond memories from his iconic roles, perhaps some light anecdotes about working with legendary directors. This was decidedly not part of the plan. "George," Ford said, his tone taking on a harder edge, "I've been in this business for over 50 years. I've seen it change, evolve, and yes, sometimes I think we lose sight of what really matters, telling good stories that entertain people. That's not a political statement, that's an artistic one." Stephanopoulos leaned forward slightly, sensing an opportunity to press further. "But when you say, lose sight of what really matters, aren't you essentially dismissing the importance of representation and inclusion in filmmaking? These aren't just political talking points. They're about giving voices to people who have been historically marginalized in Hollywood." The question struck a nerve. Ford's jaw tightened visibly, and for a moment, the studio fell into an uncomfortable silence. The cameras captured every micro-expression, every subtle shift in the actor's demeanor, as he processed what he clearly viewed as a deliberate provocation. "I'm not dismissing anything," Ford replied, his voice now carrying a distinct chill. "I'm saying that the primary job of a filmmaker is to tell a compelling story. Everything else is secondary. When that order gets reversed, when the message becomes more important than the story, that's when you lose audiences." The host wasn't backing down. If anything, Stephanopoulos seemed energized by Ford's growing discomfort, like a shark sensing blood in the water. But surely you can understand why some would see your position as privileged. As someone who's benefited enormously from a system that historically favored white male leads, isn't there some responsibility to acknowledge that? Ford's hands gripped the arms of his chair more tightly. The veteran actor had faced hostile interviews before, but something about Stephanopoulos' approach, the way he was framing these questions not as inquiries but as accusations, was clearly getting under his skin. The audience could sense they were witnessing something unprecedented. Harrison Ford, the man who had faced down countless villains on screen, was being pushed to his breaking point by a television host. Responsibility? Ford repeated, his voice rising slightly. My responsibility is to the craft, to the audience, and to telling stories that matter. I've never discriminated against anyone, and I resent the implication that I have. The tension in the room was now undeniable. Stephanopoulos had successfully maneuvered the conversation into territory where Ford was no longer the beloved movie star promoting his latest project, but a man being forced to defend positions he had perhaps never fully articulated even to himself. The host's strategy was becoming clear: push the notoriously private actor into saying something controversial, something that would generate headlines and social media buzz long after the interview ended. I'm not making implications, Harrison, Stephanopoulos said with that practiced calm that made his words even more cutting. I'm simply asking you to address the reality that your most famous roles, Han Solo, Indiana Jones, represent exactly the kind of traditional masculine archetypes that many in Hollywood are now questioning. This was the moment when everyone in the studio knew that the interview had crossed a line from which there might be no return. Ford's face had gone from irritated to genuinely angry, and the legendary self-control that had made him one of Hollywood's most professional actors was beginning to crack under the relentless pressure of Stephanopoulos' questioning. You want to talk about archetypes? Ford's voice cut through the studio like a blade, his famous composure finally beginning to fracture. Let me tell you something about archetypes, George. Han Solo and Indiana Jones aren't just traditional masculine anything. They're characters who fight for what's right, who protect people, who make sacrifices for others. If that's somehow problematic now, then this industry has lost its way completely. The studio audience fell into a stunned silence. This wasn't the measured, diplomatic Harrison Ford they were used to seeing in interviews. This was a man pushed to his limit, and Stephanopoulos seemed almost gleeful at having finally broken through the actor's famously controlled exterior. But that's exactly the point, Stephanopoulos pressed, his voice taking on an almost predatory quality. These characters you've made famous, they solve problems through violence, they're emotionally unavailable to the women in their lives, they operate outside the law when it suits them. Don't you see how that might be sending the wrong message to audiences, especially young men? Ford's hands were now visibly trembling with barely contained rage. The cameras captured every detail of his transformation from Hollywood legend to a man under siege. His publicist was frantically making cutting motions with her hand, trying to signal to the production team that this needed to stop, but the show's producers were clearly loving every second of this unexpected drama. Wrong message? Ford's voice rose another octave, and several audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The wrong message is telling people that heroism is toxic, that standing up for what's right is somehow problematic. These characters inspired generations of people to be better, to fight for justice, to protect those who can't protect themselves. But Stephanopoulos was relentless, sensing that he had Ford exactly where he wanted him. And yet, Harrison, isn't it interesting that in all your most famous roles, you're essentially playing the same character? The lone wolf, the man who doesn't need anyone, who solves everything through action rather than communication. What does that say about your own worldview? The question struck at something deeper than professional disagreement. Ford's entire body language changed, his shoulders squaring, as if he were preparing for physical combat rather than verbal sparring. The transformation was so dramatic that some audience members actually gasped audibly. My worldview? Ford's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than if he had been shouting. My worldview is that there are still good guys and bad guys in this world, George. And right now, I'm starting to wonder which category you fall into. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Stephanopoulos' eyes lit up with the kind of predatory gleam that suggested he knew he had just been handed television gold. But he was also playing with fire now, and everyone in the studio could feel it. That's quite an accusation, coming from someone who's made millions playing characters who shoot first and ask questions later. Stephanopoulos shot back, his composure never wavering even as Ford's was completely disintegrating. Perhaps that says more about you than you'd care to admit. Ford stood up so suddenly that his chair nearly toppled backward. The sound echoed through the studio like a gunshot, and several security personnel could be seen tensing at the edges of the set. The 81-year-old actor might have been past his physical prime, but the fury radiating from him was palpable and genuinely intimidating. "Don't you dare," Ford said, pointing a shaking finger directly at Stephanopoulos, who remained seated with an almost smug expression of satisfaction. "Don't you dare psychoanalyze me based on characters I've played. You want to know what's wrong with this industry? It's people like you, people who tear down everything that came before just to make themselves feel important." The studio had gone completely silent, except for the hum of cameras and equipment. Even the production assistants had stopped moving, mesmerized by the unprecedented spectacle of one of Hollywood's most respected figures having what appeared to be a complete breakdown on live television. Stephanopoulos finally stood as well, but his movement was calculated, theatrical, a stark contrast to Ford's explosive reaction. "I'm simply asking you to engage with legitimate criticism of work that has shaped popular culture for decades. If you can't handle that conversation, perhaps that says something about the validity of those criticisms." The words hit Ford like physical blows. His face had gone from red with anger to an almost pale shade of fury that suggested he was operating on pure adrenaline now. The careful media training that had served him through decades of interviews had completely abandoned him, leaving only raw, unfiltered emotion. "Legitimate criticism?" Ford's voice cracked with incredulity. "You call this ambush journalism legitimate? You invited me here under false pretenses, then spent the entire time trying to tear down everything I've worked for. This isn't journalism, George. This is character assassination." Stephanopoulos smiled then, and it was perhaps the most chilling moment of the entire confrontation. It was the smile of someone who had achieved exactly what they set out to do, regardless of the collateral damage. "I invited you here to have an honest conversation about your work and its impact. If you find that threatening, perhaps you should ask yourself why." Ford's response was immediate and volcanic. "Threatening? You want to see threatening?" He took a step toward Stephanopoulos, and suddenly the tension in the studio became genuinely dangerous. Security personnel moved closer to the set, and Ford's publicist had risen from her seat, her face a mask of horror as she watched her client's career potentially imploding in real time. The confrontation had reached a point where everyone present understood they were witnessing something that would be analyzed and discussed for years to come. This wasn't just a heated interview anymore. It was a cultural moment, a collision between old Hollywood and new media that was playing out with devastating intensity under the harsh studio lights. "You know what your problem is, George." Ford's voice had dropped to a menacing growl as he loomed over the still-seated host. "You've never created anything in your life. You've never put yourself on the line, never taken a risk, never built something from nothing. All you do is tear down what others have built, and you call it journalism." Stephanopoulos remained seated, but his smugness was beginning to crack slightly as he realized the situation might be spiraling beyond his control. "I'm a journalist, Harrison. My job is to ask difficult questions, to hold public figures accountable for their influence on society." "Accountable?" Ford's laugh was bitter and harsh. "You want to hold me accountable for inspiring millions of people? For giving them heroes to look up to? For showing them that sometimes you have to fight for what's right?" He gestured wildly with his hands, his entire body language screaming barely contained violence. "What have you ever inspired, George? What have you ever built that made the world a better place? The studio audience was transfixed, watching this legendary figure completely unravel before their eyes. Some were recording on their phones, others sat in shocked silence, but everyone understood they were witnessing something unprecedented in television history. Stephanopoulos finally stood, perhaps realizing that remaining seated while an increasingly agitated Ford towered over him was no longer tactically sound. I've spent my career informing the public, holding powerful people accountable, asking the questions that need to be asked. Questions that need to be asked? Ford's voice rose to nearly a shout. Or questions designed to destroy? There's a difference, and you damn well know it. You didn't bring me here for an interview, you brought me here for an execution. The host's mask was slipping now, his practiced composure giving way to something uglier underneath. If you can't handle legitimate scrutiny of your work and its cultural impact, perhaps you shouldn't be in the public eye. That was the final straw. Ford's face contorted with an anger so pure and focused that several people in the front row of the audience actually recoiled. Cultural impact? Let me tell you about cultural impact, you pretentious hack. Indiana Jones taught kids that history matters, that knowledge is worth fighting for, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Han Solo showed them that redemption is possible, that even selfish people can become heroes when it counts. Ford began pacing now, his movements sharp and predatory, like a caged animal looking for an escape route. But you wouldn't understand that, would you, George? Because you've never understood what it means to actually touch people's lives in a positive way. All you understand is destruction. Stephanopoulos tried to regain control of the situation, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that only made things worse. Harrison, I think you're overreacting. This is exactly the kind of defensive response that suggests these criticisms have merit. The words hit Ford like a slap across the face. His pacing stopped abruptly, and he turned to face Stephanopoulos with an expression of such contempt that the host actually took a step backward. Overreacting? Ford's voice was deadly quiet now, more terrifying than when he had been shouting. You ambush me with loaded questions, twist my words, attack everything I've worked for my entire career, and I'm overreacting? He moved closer to Stephanopoulos again, and this time the host's composure finally cracked completely. The smug confidence drained from his face as he realized he had pushed one of Hollywood's most respected figures past the point of no return. You want to know what's really wrong with this industry, George? Ford continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. It's people like you who think that tearing something down is the same as building something up. It's people who mistake cynicism for intelligence, who think that asking gotcha questions makes them important. Ford's publicist had given up trying to salvage the situation and was now frantically texting on her phone, probably alerting crisis management teams and preparing damage control statements. But Ford was beyond caring about the professional consequences now. I've been making movies for over 50 years, he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience and frustration. I've worked with the greatest directors who ever lived, told stories that have entertained and inspired millions of people around the world. And you sit there in your little chair, with your little questions, thinking you can reduce all of that to some political talking points. Stephanopoulos made one final attempt to maintain his journalistic authority. I'm simply trying to understand how someone with your influence views their responsibility to... Stop. Ford's single word cut through the air like a blade. Just stop. I don't owe you an explanation for my life's work. I don't owe you a defense of characters that have brought joy to countless people. And I sure as hell don't owe you the satisfaction of watching me dance to your tune. The studio fell into complete silence. Even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath, afraid that any sound might shatter the moment. Ford stood in the center of the set, his chest heaving with emotion, looking around at the assembled crowd with a mixture of disgust and disappointment. You know what the real tragedy is here? Ford said, his voice now carrying a note of profound sadness beneath the anger. This could have been a conversation about storytelling, about the craft of filmmaking, about the joy of creating something that outlasts your own life. Instead, you turned it into this circus. He looked directly into the main camera, addressing the audience at home rather than the man who had tormented him for the past 30 minutes. To anyone watching this who still believes in heroes, who still believes that stories matter, who still believes that sometimes the good guys can win, don't let people like this convince you otherwise. Ford then did something that no one in the studio expected. He reached up and removed his lapel microphone, the small gesture somehow carrying more dramatic weight than all the shouting that had preceded it. The tiny piece of equipment hit the studio floor with a barely audible thud that nonetheless seemed to echo through the silence. "This interview is over," Ford announced, his voice carrying a finality that left no room for argument. He turned toward the exit, his movements deliberate and dignified despite everything that had just transpired. Stephanopoulos, perhaps realizing that his moment of television gold was slipping away, made one last desperate attempt to keep his guest on the set. "Harrison, surely we can continue this conversation in a more productive way." Ford stopped walking and turned back one final time, his expression a mixture of pity and contempt. "George, in 50 years of making movies, I've worked with some real professionals and some real amateurs. But I've never encountered anyone quite like you, someone who mistakes destruction for creation, who confuses cynicism with insight." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Good luck with your show." With that, Harrison Ford walked off the set and out of the studio, leaving behind a stunned silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Stephanopoulos stood alone under the harsh lights, his victory suddenly feeling hollow as he realized that in breaking down one of Hollywood's most beloved figures, he had also revealed something ugly about himself that the entire world had now witnessed.